What's up, everybody? Peter Exodus O'Coffer here. Welcome back to another episode of the Personal Level Up the Personal Branding video show. Been a minute since I've done some personal branding. I did do Elvis the movie, the podcast, but I want to balance it out. I've been doing a lot of music history and music appreciation lately, and still have a lot to say about branding, and branding's important. So today we're doing the one and only David Bowie, and Bowie's interesting for me. Because I was kind of a Bowie. I mean, I was a Bowie fan, and in middle school, I would just sit down and just listen to the radio. And my favorite Bowie songs were and some of my first favorite rock songs. I mean, it was Suffragette City and Space Oddity, and I've done an episode on Space Oddity already. Um, so I was affected. I was a young adult when Let's Dance dropped and Little China Girl. Um, but I was surprised when Bowie passed. It really affected me, and I think it's the impression he made, in middle school, because I think that's kind of when you stop being a teeny bopper and liking this song and that song and be like, okay, this music stuff, I like this. Who am I gonna ride and or die with? And so even though initially I didn't ride or die with David Bowie, I mean, I liked him and it affected me, and so since his death, I've run through his whole catalog, and David Bowie is kind of he's probably the first to really dig into branding and brand, because we know he had a bunch of personas back in the day, and he struggled until his most famous persona, Ziggy Stardust. But yeah, and he was a very a great musician too. But David kind of melded um, music, fashion, and art. And David Bowie took fashion and really turned it into an art form, and so, um, and a lot of people look good, but David kind of gave it meaning beyond just looking good. In my trios, when I did James Brown, Sly Stone, and George Clinton and P Funk, I mean, I talked about George's personas. Like George, David didn't really totally flesh his personas out. His most fleshed out one was Ziggy Stardust, but they all still worked. Interestingly enough, earlier I listened to a YouTube guy. His name is Colton. I think that's his last name, Colton, and he did a YouTube on uh, creating an alter ego for yourself. And he mentions David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust, and he talks about Beyonce and Sasha Fierce. And Beyonce is very upfront about creating Sasha Fierce for because of her performance anxieties and just being in public in general. I mean, it ain't easy in this era being famous, because everybody has their smartphones that can record you at any time. So if you're having a bad moment, and then performing ain't easy either. I mean, everybody gets some sort of anxiety, and for some people, it never leaves. And um, I mean, I remember watching a documentary in Van Halen, and Eddie's dad was a classic pianist, and he said Eddie is like 13, 14, 15, 16 year olds like, Dad, how do you deal with stage anxiety? And he said, I drink alcohol first. And that's what Eddie did, throughout his career. And then he did have a drinking problem. So, and when you're always like, well, why are all these these musicians, getting hooked on drugs, part of it is that anxiety, they didn't have anxiety meds, back in the day. Now, hopefully these younger, these, Gen X, Gen Z musicians, hopefully they're taking whatever anxiety meds rather than, harder drugs like, the folks before them. But and then the other one that Colton mentioned is being doing a an alter ego is Slim Shady, and took me a while to understand Eminem. He had a very very bad childhood. Was bullied a lot, um, and he couldn't come out as Eminem with some of the crazy lyrics he writes. So he invented a an alter ego, Slim Shady, and it worked. So anyway, Colton talks about people inventing these alter egos to help them with in life with with things as they forge into new areas and are learning new things and need new skills and have to stay focused and locked in and stay the course. And so so he starts off with you know find your character, build your character, and it's literally almost like it was almost like sitting in a writing workshop. Because I've written two fantasy novels and character development. I mean, he had three stages, and then he's like, well, and then you create your alter ego, and then you interview your alter ego. So I mean, I was watching. I was like, I've done this in the past. It's not the same method he uses, just because I mean, creating an inner alter ego for myself is kind of easy, being that I have 12 to 15 main characters I've created in my science fiction fantasy universe. So I use a different method, but it kind of works. But anyway, so Bowie invented Ziggy Stardust to, I mean, he had stage anxiety. And what a alter ego he was. It's interesting because when you look at the archetypes of people, I mean, you got the betas, and everybody knows about the betas. I think depending on where you look, there's 6 to 7 of them. But you got betas, and the alphas are the most people fall in one of those, and you got what gammas and whatnot. But um, and then you got sigmas, and then you have probably the newest one. A lot of folks don't even talk about them yet, but zetas, and zetas, um, they are kind of, they don't subscribe or buy into gender roles, so they're fluid, and they'll break the rules. And the interesting thing about Ziggy Stardust is Ziggy was not male or female. Ziggy was totally alien. So in this whole debate, with the rights bashing uh, transgender folks. I mean, Ziggy wasn't even transgender. Ziggy was a whole different thing, and it was just brilliant by Bowie what he did, because that was his big album. I think, Space Odyssey was before that, and I believe Changes. So he had, and Space Odyssey blew up big, and then he didn't. Nothing happened after that, and then Changes kind of, but he was struggling, even though he had those two big songs. And Ziggy Stardust, just took him to another level, and it took his live show to another level. The other interesting thing about David Bowie is he had schizophrenia in his family. So his mom, two aunts, and a half brother all had schizophrenia, and a couple of those four committed suicide. So David kind of lived in fear of that his entire um, adult life, and that kind of, in many ways, impacted his, his music and then his outlook on the world. So, I mean, Ziggy was his most famous, but he had Major Tom, uh, Aladdin Sane, Halloween Jack, the Thin White Duke, late 70s, probably the other one, and the Soul Man. Um, and I remember, probably about 2 years ago, I ran across these um, playlists on um, Spotify, goth or rock music. I'm like, I've heard the term. What is this music? And so I listened one day, and I was and literally half of them, they were the children of Bowie, and that, um, he did this type of, music and um, a little bit in the 70s, but in the mid 80s, it was kind of a little industrial sound to it, industrial rock going back, I think, to Tim Machine when he was in that band. So yeah, there's I mean, I'm not going to say he invented that subgenre, but he certainly contributed to that subgenre. And there's a whole lot of Bowie sounded stuff on those goth playlists. So who else did this? I mean, I talked about George Clinton already. Grace Jones had her own look. She didn't do personas. Lady Gaga is the same way. I mean, Lady Gaga really uh, was the next, in my opinion, to really take fashion into art. It hasn't happened very often. Uh, and um, and Prince did have a few personas. He had Camille, Spooky Electric. Those were actually he talked about in songs. I mean, Spooky Electric was from Love Sexy and was kind of like a trickster and not a good person. And Camille was, his androgynous persona. And then Prince liked to have fun with folks. So in the early 80s, he had Jamie Starr and Joey Coco. And so Prince would write songs for other people and would use, the song is written by Jamie Starr or Joey Coco. And I think Alexander Nevermind was another one. And so even uh, he even called out in DMSR Jamie Starr for being a thief for stealing the song. So Prince had definitely had that sense of humor. Bowie, his early stuff, even into the mid '70s, his stuff was there's a lot of acoustic guitar in there. I didn't realize how much he used the acoustic guitar back in the day, and and very guitar based. And then he got more, the '80s. He was uh, in the late '70s. I mean, he got more, the Blue Eyed Soul, David. I mean, Let's Dance, Fame. You know, people, oh, that's disco inspired. I can't. I have to look at that if that was disco or funk. It does straddle the line, though. I have to listen to that now. I mean, I'm riffing as I speak. Because everybody thought, um, another one bites the dust by Queen and, Miss You by the Stones was disco. But we'll see where Let's Dance was, I just off the top of my head, a little more funk based. Just off the top of my head, I think, Fame is probably disco based, but well, at some point, I'll get back to you on that. 'Cause I'm sure at some point down the road, I'm going to do my top 10 favorite David Bowie songs. And so I will provide my answer to this question, when I do that somewhere down the road. If Jim Morrison was the first true rebel of rock and roll, and I think he was, and I think the Doors movie gets that. And I think eventually I wanted to go back and do an episode just on the Doors movie. Um, Bowie was the quintessential rebel because I mean he spoke to the dispossessed and the outsiders. He embraced them, and that's why his appeal is so strong, and I think why he will live on. Yeah, Keith Richards is not, Bowie and Mick Jagger are very close. Keith Richards is not a fan of Bowie. Uh, he hated when David Bowie came around. He's like, David's gonna steal something, and hey, everybody borrows. But I think his he was the first to really speak to the outsider so strongly, and I think that's gonna to resonate for a long time, just like Freddie Mercury, with Queen is going to resonate because of his gender identity struggles, and and being a superstar in that time when it was not cool, to be gay or bi, and certainly the movie, and I haven't delved in and done any biographies, but I'm not gonna say for Freddie what he was because he never said that, whether he was bi or gay, and it's not my you know job or whatever to make that declaration. That's him because that's who he was, who he was, and who he wanted to be. So yeah, I mean David Bowie was an adventurer. He went into a lot of different genres. Started acoustic, kind of rockish. I mean, his very first album is very much how would you describe? I mean, it was sort of early Beatlesque. I mean, I think it was 67 or 66. I mean, he was trying to I mean, you could tell he was, right there, trying to be the Beatles to Who and the Stones, and it wasn't bad, but it just didn't go anywhere. And he had that, Space Oddity hit big for him. One of the greatest, the great songs of all time, in my opinion. Did a show on it already, and then he got into, started getting into Blue Eyed Soul in the late '70s and the '80s. Then he did Tin Machine, and then he, you know, industrial rock, and then he just, throughout the '90s, he was very experimental. I mean, using drum machines and you know, power guitar chords, and it was, so he was always, pushing the envelope and trying to, find new things. And I really, his last album, Black Star, was really, it was very well received. I think it was released the day before he passed or the day after. And it's, as David at his experimentally best. So yeah, trying to bounce things out here, do some more branding. Been sitting on this, had this outline for a while, but I got so excited about the history and stuff, like steer it back to the branding stuff. So I'm gonna do a couple more branding stuff, and I have a couple outlines for some songs. Sitting there, and then I also have some good outlines for some history stuff. So just to keep rolling along. Appreciate you coming through. As I said earlier in this episode, I write science fiction fantasy. Got two novels on and a novella on Amazon under the name Peter O'Coffer, and got 5 albums under the name Exodus. So about to drop some singles. Want to see how that does with the algorithms with Spotify and the other streaming platforms. So working on those. Well, laid some vocals down last weekend, so I'm gonna start polishing those up, and maybe hopefully get a few out late this year, 2023, and then in early 2024, release some more singles. But appreciate your support. Thank you for coming through, and I will see you next episode.